Hi. So at Cabby, we until recently employed two different kinds of taxonomists. We actually employed real taxonomists who classified physical objects, right, like organisms. And we also employed the taxonomists we still do, who do the things of classifying them into controlled vocabularies. And they shared something in common, which is they all like to fight, right? So I think this is for Thane, but it'd be interesting to see what other comments that the rest of the panel has, right? If you're doing a Taxonomy Commons, how are you going to handle conflict resolution when multiple different versions of the preferred term come in from multiple different stakeholders?
Right. So get them all out in the backyard and give them a six-pack and let them duke it out. Whoever's still standing gets to name the term. No, I think that's a critical question. I think there is, at the end of the day, there is going to have to be some decision process, and that would be developed at the governance level, and it would be executed at the staff level. That being said, the architecture needs to accommodate variety within, and in several of the things that we were showing, both Shivram and myself, we were sort of showing how we can accommodate different representations but normalize them back to a standardized representation. So femoral hernia, whether it's hernia, femoral, NOS, not otherwise specified, or whatever, we're going to have to agree on something, but the architecture has to accommodate two things. One is an equivalency system, so that if I need to use a different representation, or I have a data set that has a different representation, or I have users who have their own representations, that can be accommodated. And secondly, the architecture has to accommodate variability of display. So there's a difference between normalizing behind the scenes that we're all pointing to the same concept, and that could be a number representing that concept, and how I display that to a user in a given interface. And so if you can accommodate that, I think you can adjudicate most of those. In other words, you're not going to tell somebody you can't call it that. You're going to say to somebody, what you're talking about when you call it that refers to this concept that's normalized.
I would like to just add to that. It's a good question, because people who are in the business of organizing data oftentimes have the perspective, I shouldn't say often, some have the perspective that there can be a upper level ontology that defines and states you will call it this. The linked data community in particular has recognized, listen, we're not the site crowd. We're not going to be able to agree on everybody calling it this way. And so it's what's the difference in the world of logicians between the neats and the scruffies. The neats are the people who believe you can define a worldview of something and force everybody to agree. The scruffies say, sorry, we realize that world order will never exist, and we politely agree to call it different things. Could be by way of different languages or, in fact, different terms, and you're permitted to do that in the world of linked data. And they have representations as same as, et cetera. So the idea is just, let's not all go out. If there are 100 organizations describing data, let's not have 100 different ways to call it what was the example you gave about a femur? Femoral hernia. Let's maybe agree to say there'll be 6 or 10, and we can live with 6 or 10, but let's just shrink it down a little bit. And if somebody comes along and wants to come up with an 11th or 12th, that's permissible too. But there's certainly no point in having 100 different descriptions of it.
Also, let me just make one other quick point. And the example I gave about disordered sensations and sensation disorder, you're never going to change the authors. I mean, forget that. I'm not talking about changing the content. I'm talking about changing your organization of that concept in your content database and your products. So it's about it's about the metadata you're putting on, not about what the authors are creating or what the users are calling it in a search engine, which will also never change. You have to accommodate.
Right, I think that's go ahead, Shiva. I just want to add to what Bernadette and Thane just said, and I think that's a great question. I'm going to take a little bit of a very polarizing view here, and actually more towards what Bernadette just said, and saying that we ain't going to agree on a single standard. It's never going to happen. And the problem is not so much philosophical, it's practical, right? as we're especially on the clinical side or basic science research side, right? We're already all the time at a cutting edge level. So we're going to find ourselves in situations where the models do not describe what we are doing. And at that point in time, what do? Do we go to some governing body or some institution and say, hey, we need models for this? And they're going to come back after 2 years with this, right? You're not going to sit around waiting for it to happen. So the best possible situation at that point is you are the expert in the area that you're dealing with. You go and create a model that best describes the work that you do. Now, and move forward, right? Now, the community needs to pick up on that, needs to help you move forward, needs to apply standards or processes that will help you create that model in the best possible way and integrate that back into the other models that are there. Now, linked data just doesn't happen by magic, right? You call it femoral hernia and give it an ID, 1, 2, 3. Somebody else also has that same concept but gives a different ID, ABC. Now, it doesn't magically combine. How do you say that this concept, femoral hernia here, is the same thing as this concept, femoral hernia here? And so basically for the data, for the linked data to be interoperable, right, you need models. And this is where Thane was pointing out, as we have data silos. And the approach that Thane has taken with Taxonomy Commons is let's not create model silos now by creating different models of this. So let's reuse what we have. And where we need to extend, and researchers always need to extend. There, let's leverage what is existing, extend it so that interoperability of models is guaranteed there. And once the interoperability of models is guaranteed, interoperability of data is guaranteed. And then magic happens.
Yeah, I think a really important thing to remember is that this isn't about mandating, it's about enabling. Mm-hmm. So we're not talking about forcing anybody to change their internal systems. I have this discussion with people on just simple metadata issues like Onyx metadata for books. It's an interchange format. It doesn't mean that they have to throw out their entire metadata management system that they've got internally that they can't change. They've spent too much time and money doing that. But they can't give that information to the outside world and have it mean anything unless they speak Onyx. So it's a matter of how you're relating your content to the content of the rest of the world. Yes, the flip side of that is if you don't, in fact, have that kind of organized system and model, don't go reinventing it. It's out there already. I don't know. The point that Bernadette made is so important. And I hit this with so many clients. They try to reinvent these wheels before they even investigate the fact that there is a vocabulary out there. Use that vocabulary so that the rest of the world will know what you mean when you say XYZ.
And the best, and people then say, well, how do I find out? And that's something actually that W3 is in our working group we're working on, because it's hard right now for somebody in a government agency to say what vocabularies exist for describing organizations or people, et cetera. It's not really that easy. So we're writing them, and I'm authoring the best practices document. So we're getting better at that, but that it has been, and I acknowledge it has been a little bit challenging to find where these vocabularies are published and making sure that they're high quality. So we're doing checklists. If you're going to develop a vocabulary, make sure it conforms to these best practices. We won't necessarily recommend which one to use because there are many, but at least evaluate it according to this criteria. So it's getting better documented.
And of course, this is what Taxonomy Commons is about, is providing a centralized place
there's a role
for the interchange and management of all the. Am I right, Thane? I don't want to be taking words out of your mouth. But.
No, that's exactly right. Just a starting point where we can begin to coordinate. Right.
Richard.
Hi. I want to take a bit of an issue, actually, Bernadette, with one of the things that you said in the latter part of your presentation, because you kind of asserted that linked data was web scale, and I think I understand what you mean by that, in the sense that you're saying basically anybody can publish linked data on any piece of the web, and we can read it because it's on the web. So it's a bit like saying the web is web scale in a way. It's not actually, and I think there's a dangerous kind of illusion there, which is maybe that what we would like to believe is that linked data data. When we talk about web scale, we often talk about NoSQL databases these days, which are web scale databases which, you know, we talk about the fire hose of Twitter and the mass of data that's inside Facebook. And so I just wanted to I wanted to pull you up a little bit on that, because, you know, saying the web is web scale is a bit of an empty statement in my mind. And I also wanted just to sort of ask you a little bit about that sort of NoSQL thing, because what's happened recently has been a massive growth in NoSQL databases. And it's kind of odd in my mind that all of those companies, you know, the high-tech companies that really have to deal with the fire hose of data, none of them have chosen to use a kind of RDF triple store type of model. They've all gone their own way. And I wondered why that might be.
I would say there actually are some, Google's certainly using RDF, so I don't really agree that they aren't using RDF. They're using NoSQL approaches because of the constraints of relational databases, but to my knowledge they are. Facebook, you know, they're solving a lot of problems of scale with very, very large infrastructure and, you know, Amazon Web Services, but that has a lot to do with the hardware and software architecture. But a lot of them are using RDF.
I think another thing to keep in mind is that this is an evolving ecosystem, and so some of the systems, for example, that Richard is probably alluding to, I'm thinking of a couple that I might name that I guess I probably shouldn't specifically name, but yes, they're designed for creating, for working with unstructured data. They are not inherently RDF triple stores, and yet in many cases what you'll find is that they see the value of this and therefore start to behave like RDF triple stores anyway. MarkLogic is one that I'm very familiar with. And, you know, no, it's not an RDF triple store at its heart.
They're moving to RDF.
But they're moving to RDF. Yeah. And in fact, we can't get into the technicalities of RDF and triple store, but there's a fourth piece, because there's the three pieces that are what we mean by the triple, and then there's context. And I think context is really important too, particularly in this, let me use a very, very general term, terminology area. Because, and this is why, again, I think Taxonomy Commons is such an important initiative, because a term that has a very precise meaning among a certain interest group may mean something very different precisely in a different interest group. So not only do you need to know what that term is, but in many cases you need to know who is using that term. In what context are they using that term? Because if it's in this context, it means this. If it's in this context, it means that. So basically what we're working on here is a way, it's the Rosetta Stone, basically. It's trying to get all of these vocabularies that are in fact specialized, because specialists in particular areas have their vocabularies and use specific terms and mean things in a specific way. But the rest of the world doesn't know what those are. And so they can't connect to the rest of the world unless these kinds of initiatives get somewhere.
So I want to add to that. One of the common assumptions that we make is it's RDF or relational databases. The thing is, they're not the same things we're talking about. RDF is a data format. And it can be, once you have data which is described using this data format, the RDF data format, it can be stored in many different ways. You can store it or serialize it, that's the technical word for it. You can serialize it as a text file or as an XML, in an XML format. RDF XML is one of the serialization formats for it. You can take that very same data and put it into an RDBMS data store. It's called a triple store, usually. Now, there is no reason why you cannot use a NoSQL databases to store this data, and Elsevier is doing that. We are actually using NoSQL databases to store our RDF data. So it becomes a delivery format. It's a technical implementation of how you store RDF. Now, the other thing is, the other side of this is what what Bill was saying. You have Taxonomy Commons and all this. We have data standards, right? Now, RDF is one of the standards that we use. There are other ways in which models can be described. Now, I work with a number of other open bodies like the BFO or the OBO Foundry. which also is a big player in the biosciences community, and they have a format which is called as the OBO format. Now, the OBO format is interchangeable with the RDF and OWL formats. Okay, these are all different frameworks for describing data. And you can use any one of them and be interchangeable, interoperable in all these things. BioPortal is another open source vocabulary, format or vocabulary, a resource that we use very commonly for, exploring ontologies, exploring what models are there, what's the common information. UMLS is other source. And I'm waiting to actually see what Taxonomy Commons is going to have and, work with Thane on this.
Right. Good.
So, to clarification, RDF is a data model. It's not only it's serialized in a wide variety of serializations, as Shivram said, and it is a NoSQL database. So, for example, the NoSQL conference, we go talk about, RDF triple stores. Now, our product is agnostic about what RDF triple store it sits on, but RDF is a non-SQL or NoSQL database.
And don't get scared off by, those of you that, think, well, haven't we just figured out that we need XML and now you're telling us we need
So RDF sort of delivers on that final 10 or 20% of the promise that you thought you were getting when you spent millions and millions of dollars to convert all of your content to reformat, but it does not replace, and it does, all of the people we work with have XML databases. So it's just providing additional value.
And it actually isn't that hard. Once you get the concept, it's a very useful, simple, clear concept.
But I think in the last 10 minutes, we've made it sound kind of hard, actually.
Well, thanks for your patience. We've gone 15 minutes over.